My name's Tim Bonner. I'm Chief Executive of the Countryside Alliance. Thank you all for coming today, and thank you especially to our panel. I won't introduce them all individually because they need no introduction. But also you've got in front of you and some biogs, and we've got fairly limited time, so I want to give you as much opportunity as possible to ask the questions that you want to. But to set the scene, I suppose it's slightly difficult to come to a political party conference and criticise a political party. Luckily, I don't have to, because Labour has critiqued its own relationships with the countryside for a very long time now. Going back to 2015, when Maria Eagle wrote a paper called Labour's Rural Problem, we worked with the Fabians back in 2017 and produced a document called Labour Country, which essentially put suggested that Labour's agenda was not talking to people in rural constituencies and rural voters more widely. After the 2019 election, Ben himself wrote a really interesting paper on Labour's relationship with the countryside, and the Countryside Alliance, we again produced another paper, which was that was called Elephant in the Countryside, Labour's Rural Problem, harking back to Maria Eagle's paper. And interestingly, I think that was largely accepted. Daniel will be able to tell us more, but Luke Pollard at the time, the Shadow DEFRA secretary, was fairly open in the fact that, there were a couple of lines, being too comfortable with being too urban. And he said, and I have to say I was quite surprised about it, he did write on Labour List that the reports by the Fabians and the Countryside Alliance are not made for easy reading, but they tell an honest story about how Labour retreated from rural communities. So we have a line of thought here, which isn't from here. It's from inside the party itself, and it has been very noticeable that Keir Starmer has sought to engage. He's spoken to the National Farmers Union conference. He's talked about countryside being in his DNA. Most recently, an article in Country Life magazine, which is actually probably more often seen on the coffee tables of Chelsea than it is in too many farm kitchens. But there is a real opportunity. There is an obvious point of engagement, and the electoral mass for this, I'm sure Ben will talk about this, is really straightforward. There are so many rural constituencies in which I think the last time on some degree of rurality, there's about 2 constituencies left that Labour holds after the 2019 general election. So the route to number 10 has to be through the countryside. That's the argument that certainly the Fabians have made, and it makes political sense. So there are efforts going on there, but we need to be honest that the ghosts of a difficult relationship in the past still hang over the countryside, and I was particularly taken by the line that you used in that 21 paper about there being a cultural aversion to Labour in rural areas. And that was echoed by Peter Mandelson, who gave a speech to a conference that we organised in June, which Daniel very kindly attended as well, where he talked about it being wrong for the left to stoke culture wars against rural communities in exactly the same way as it's wrong for the right to do that, to stoke culture wars against minorities. And so at an incredibly interesting period in politics, and an incredibly important period for the Labour Party, obviously, we have a moment at which Labour needs to engage, and from various different angles, I hope that we will hear some different ideas about how Labour does that. I'm going to ask our panellists to say a few words, a couple of minutes each, and then open the floor, and hopefully we can have an interesting debate. And Daniel, sorry to set you off, but would you like to start us away?
I'd be very, very happy to start, Tim, and thank you for inviting me again. I think last year we were down in the bowels of the conference, weren't we? And I was reflecting on just what a difference a year makes. I think this time last year, Raoul Jawardner was the Shadows, well, not the Shadow, he was the Secretary of State. And an awful lot has happened in the year, and I'll just reflect on a few of those. Certainly from my point of view, getting to speak at the Countryside Conference at Hatfield was a highlight in my life, I have to say. I never imagined I'd be asked to speak on a platform following Rory Stewart, Henry Dimbleby, I won't mention Teresa Coffey in passing, but she was there, and then Peter Mandelson, and then me. And I think it was interesting that you effectively had 2 Labour speakers on that platform. But I think it shows we fully understand the need to re-engage. And I think you're right that there's been a recognition that post-2010, partly it's just electoral arithmetic. If you lose your representatives at the highest level, it makes it harder. And you then begin to lose, and to some extent, you've already lost your representatives at local level, because that tends to happen when you're in government. And that begins to become problematic. I would say that Labour's never not been in the countryside. There are always Labour supporters. But I don't think the party as an organisation has been as engaged as it should have been, and that's been my job over the last 3 years. And I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I've been very well received. I've been around a lot of conferences, probably spoken to a lot of people in this room. The other highlight of my year, I had to say, was addressing the Oxford Farming Conference at the start of the year. And also Groundswell, which I have to say was a massive, massive turnout, as well as now my annual appearance at the Game Fair to be quizzed by Charlie Jacoby, who each year gives me a harder and harder time. I'm slightly dreading next year. But I hope what you're hearing from me is a sense of genuine desire to re-engage. And certainly I thought the polling for the Countryside Conference was interesting, because it kind of confirmed, I think, what I know, and I hope a lot of my colleagues realise, is that the countryside is really valued by the whole country. That thing, I think the polling number 2 behind the NHS is the thing that's most valued, understood as a key part of our national heritage. And when you look at the story that Keir is increasingly telling, it is a national story. Labour is a party for the whole country. Obviously the Scottish result earlier this week, very, very helpful to us. But we can only be a government for the whole country if it really is the whole country, and that has to absolutely include the countryside. And what strikes me going around actually is some of the issues that perhaps you would think are more urban issues are very alive and real in the countryside. The top issue that gets brought up with me every time is crime, frankly. And the epidemic of theft of GPS systems and so on at the moment, organised quite clearly, is causing real trauma and unhappiness. And I was in Tamworth for reasons you might understand a few days ago, and the absolutely top issue there was crime, but really nasty crime, like a lot of hair coursing issues like that in my part of the country. But this was basically people threatening people in rural communities with menaces for money, essentially. Now, this should not be the case in our country, frankly, and the reasons for it are many and complicated, but I don't think one can escape from the fact that after 13 years, our policing system is not working for people. It's not working in urban areas, and it certainly isn't working in rural areas. So Labour's offer for the whole country is absolutely as relevant to the countryside as it is to urban areas. Similarly, the other thing I hear when I go on the doorstep in rural areas is, I'm afraid, access to services. The ambulance waits are dreadful. Some of the lack of access to dentistry, dreadful. So again, the announcements being made by Labour nationally at the moment are just as salient and relevant in rural areas as they are in urban areas. But I suppose my final point would be picking up on some of the things that Peter Mandelson said in his speech to the Countryside Conference. A lot of this is about respect and understanding, and just for Labour to not go around picking unnecessary fights, which I think has sometimes been the case in the past. That's certainly not what I'm about and what I'm going to do. And of course, the agricultural transition is hugely important, and I'm not going to say too much about that because I could go on for a long, long time. But I think it is striking that the government doesn't have a proper plan for a transition to net zero for DEFRA. I mean, it's staggering when you think about it. But I mean, John Gummer has repeatedly made that point, and it's a point that I would echo. It's clear that the financial transition is troubled at the moment, again, without going into all the details. We absolutely want it to work. We want a transition to a more nature-friendly and climate-friendly method of food production. That raises a whole huge range of potential issues, but important for rural communities. And most important, I'd say, as a finishing point, is our absolute commitment to producing food in this country. And I was actually staggered by Rhys Mogg's comments last week. I don't know what kind of game he thinks he's playing, but that insult to British farming, suggesting that he's welcoming the opportunity to eat hormone-fed Australian beef. I mean, leave aside the issues around whether you think chlorine-washed chicken or hormone-fed beef systems are the ones we would choose to have. The truth is that if we have those kind of trade deals, that will basically destroy British farming. So I think the message I'd like to give you is that Labour is now the party of the countryside, because the countryside absolutely cannot rely on the Conservatives. And although you can say he's not in government, this time last year, he and Giles Wardner were in government. They were the people making the decisions. This is a scary point. All the way through the passage of the Agriculture Act, I, Luke Pollard and others, and then a few obviously on a huge scale, were warning that this was actually the plan. Well, quite clearly it is. Well, it's certainly not our plan. So I hope we can reassure people in rural areas who are absolutely committed to British food production and to making sure that rural communities are good, safe places for people to live. And I think that's a fantastic offer, and I think you'll see people supporting us in droves, and we will become the natural party of the countryside.
Thank you, Daniel. Amanda, as Daniel said, there have always been, Labour has always been in the countryside, and at local government level especially, there has been that engagement, perhaps for reasons we've heard, there hasn't been at the national level. How do you see that feeding through into improving Labour's relationship with the countryside?
I think what we saw in May, so I'm in Chesterfield, we're in Derbyshire, I can see some Derbyshire colleagues here. We saw in May across our districts, people turning to Labour. We were out in those countryside areas working hard for every seat, and we saw certainly across Derbyshire a return to Labour, and in lots of other rural areas as well, lots of our county areas, which signals well. I think in terms of, how has that happened? With our councils that have remained Labour, we've been pushing hard, we've been pushing through. So in Derbyshire we are going to be the first kind of county deal with the mayor, we know that Gordon Brown with his work and that Labour's plans for devolution are going to put more decision making in our local communities. And to be fair, that is mainly what I heard on the doorstep. People want to feel that the decisions that they're making are happening local to them, that they have an input into that. And I think in terms of local government, that's our strength. We're close to our communities, we hear our communities, and we identify the issues. I think from my perspective in local government as well, the issues are similar but not the same to the metropolitan areas. They are around economy and skills, employment and access to work. And I think the route to that does lie through local government. We have, through the LGA, the Local Government Association, we have a plan, a work local plan, where we talk about the devolution of skills and work-related employment support, localised. At the moment, we've got a massive fragmentation. Now, what's that got to do with the countryside? The issue is if you're in a rural area and you're trying to access skills and training, not only is it far, but it's fragmented. It's on a different kind of geographical location than our geographies, because the way that this current government puts out the skills and training contracts across the private company's geography, rather than what we know our actual economic geography is. So if you put things into the power of local government, they can deliver things a lot closer to home, and also relevant to local need. One of the things I would say about countryside areas is we're not all the same. In Derbyshire we've got different issues, we've got different needs, we've got a legacy actually of deindustrialisation still, while still being the countryside. And so our needs are different, and so are our jobs and skills, and that's why Labour's plan for devolution of putting, money and budgets and making sure that the decision making is happening locally is a good offer out there. For the countryside, and also transport. I don't think that you can get away from the issues. Everything runs through transport, and again, we can see in the areas that have got or getting control over transport, they're able to make those economic gains. And it's not just about transport, the cost of services and providing services in those areas. So we need to see more money coming into those areas which actually do have deprivation as well, I think. And we know as local councils, we collect those figures, we know that that's an issue. One of the last things, and I'll finish soon is I think there's a particular issue with housing that affects all of those things in the countryside. We know that some of our areas have got hollowed out. We've got second home owners We've lost our social housing. One of the most fantastic things that Labour did after the Second World War was put social housing into our villages, and we've lost them to the right to buy. So we know that Labour will give us the flexibility as councils to retain those right to buy receipts, to provide more social housing. It's been great hearing some of the announcements on that already. But it's not, we don't want to concrete over the countryside. It is about looking at what we need to do to work with our communities to make sure that people there don't have to leave to pursue work, jobs and training and progress. We know the countryside's a fantastic place to live. We want it to be a place that you can stay as well, and I think we can't get away from that. Housing runs through that. So those are my 3 areas for local government.
Very good. Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure those are issues that people will come back to in a minute. Certainly, they're very close to our parts of our policy. John, I'll ask you in a minute to sum up, but I was going to spend first to sort of encapsulate this challenge and talk about Fabian's your view of this fraught, interesting relationship between Labour and the countryside.
Thank you, Tim. I think it's important to start this conversation about what Labour's vision for the countryside is, to just look to where we were in 2019 and just see how disconnected we were with rural communities. So in 2019, Labour received the votes of just 1 in 5 of those who live in rural Great Britain. That was 33 percentage points behind the Conservative Party. And what that means when you look at rural constituencies, just 2% of rural constituencies are represented by Labour MPs. That is in fact less than the SNP and Clive, which of course by their very nature don't stand in all rural constituencies. So for a party seeking to govern the entire country, representing a smaller share of rural Great Britain than parties seeking to tear it apart shows the scale of our underperformance. And there is, as Tim highlighted, no route to power for Labour without reversing this. The Fabian Society identified 150, most likely target seats, that's based on the old boundaries, 50 of which are significantly rural. That's what we've defined as having at least a quarter of the population living in the countryside. They're mainly in Wales, Scotland and the North. Now when you look at the 150 again, and look at how many have no rural residents, just 34 of them don't have anyone in the constituency living rurally. And now that is on the old boundaries. However, when we look at the new boundaries, the data still needs to be released. Some organisations are a bit slow on that, but that's not for this discussion. What's likely to see, that's potentially the proportion of significantly rural constituencies grow, because we know particularly in the North, Scotland and Wales, constituencies are being forced together. So we may actually see a greater proportion of Labour's target seats being rural. Now, how are we doing at the moment? Well, this is based on polling we did December 2022. However, Rishi Sunak has not reversed the Tory decline, so we can be reasonably confident that what happened in December 2021 is broadly the same. In rural Great Britain, Labour was drawn, so that's from a 33 percentage point deficit to being tied with the Conservative. In the crucial 50 rural target seats, Labour was 18 percentage points ahead. But crucially, as Tim mentioned, and I won't go into too much detail now, there is a rural aversion, which means Labour's support in rural Great Britain and in the target seat are less than it would compared to Great Britain overall and in other, the 150 target seats. So there's still, while things are better, there's still a challenge for Labour. We can go into that in more detail if you wish to ask a question about that. In terms of how can we cement Labour as being a party of the countryside, the Fabians identified 3 things that we could be doing. Firstly, appeal to shared values. So it's perhaps unsurprising that people, regardless of where they live, value very similar things: home, financial security, stability and peace of mind. So Labour's campaign should be rooted in these things, using language that connects with rural voters. Then also develop a truly one nation policy agenda, and much of what Amanda chimes with what we've found. The challenges of rural Britain cannot be disconnected with the challenges in towns and cities across our country. So by offering a unifying policy agenda rooted in improved public services, investment in renewable energy, more jobs, affordable housing, we can contrast our vision with what I think we could describe as conservative divide and rural government. Rural areas should see themselves in Labour's vision of the future of our country. And then finally, address rural disaffection. Just because we want to emphasise shared values and that we have a one nation policy agenda does not mean that we tackle the very real challenges that many of us will be familiar with in rural communities. And crucially, we ask people, do you feel that your community is considered when politicians in Westminster make decisions about the future of the country? Rural communities, when we asked them, 73%, so nearly three-quarters, said that they weren't considered. That is higher than urban and town communities across our country. And we can go into it again in more detail later. We asked on a range of different metrics, do you think your community is worse off than others? Rural communities highlighted transport, housing, access to good shops, opportunities for young people, as all areas that they feel are particularly left behind compared to other communities. So if we do those three things, and we can help build trust in Labour to govern and represent the interests of rural communities, as well as those in towns and cities across the country. And if we get it right, we could look at a much redder map on election day or on election night than we have been used to, perhaps, in the very recent past.
Thank you, Ben. That's a brilliant summary, which I'm sure people will come back to. But before we do that, Jerry, we've heard from inside the Labour Party, we've heard from Westminster, from local politics and the Fabians. How do you think they're doing?
Yes, I mean, it's a big question, and to give you some context, even though I work for the Times now, I used to work for the regional press, both in Yorkshire and in Norfolk, which is where I grew up, and not that I expect that any of you study the electoral map, actually we're at Labour conference, maybe you do, particularly closely. Norfolk is a sea of blue with one Labour seat. Yorkshire's a little bit more balanced, but still a massive sea of blue. So I've been writing about these issues for a long time. The programme here very kindly just says rural experts. I wouldn't call myself an expert by any stretch of the imagination, but I do speak to a lot of politicians and strategists and those kind of people about these kind of issues. And what kind of strikes me is, reflecting what the panel have said so far, a lot of the policies that Labour is already proposing stand to benefit the countryside, stands to benefit rural communities. But I think the problem has been actually in the communication, in the PR, and the perception. So even if policies do benefit rural communities, whether that's on housing, whether that's on connectivity, whether it's buses, whatever it is, whether it's planning reform, I don't think the party's always very good at selling that to the countryside and actually saying, do you know what, no, this benefits you as well. I think what's been particularly interesting for me in recent weeks and months is the reception that Conservative politicians are getting from rural and countryside groups. I mean, I can't remember which event it was now, but Therese Coffey had a massive row with someone at an event a few weeks ago. And it was kind of, actually, I don't remember the event, but I remember it was Times Radio's John Peanut who was chairing the event. And there was a massive row, basically about how people were feeling abandoned by the Conservative Party. And it's such a change kind of for these groups to be basically robustly challenging, actually, the party that naturally believes that they often have claim over the countryside. So I think there has been a bit of change there as well. The thing that hasn't been picked up on, I think, by the panel so far, and I find particularly interesting, is the Lib Dems. I was in Mid-Beds just a couple of weeks ago, and I don't know how much you might have read about the Mid-Beds by-election, but it's getting really scrappy on the ground there, right? Like, when I was there, activists, some of yours, were having fights in the street with the Lib Dems. Right, it's happening. And this because the Lib Dems think that they have a natural right over a lot of these rural seats. We've seen it in the by-elections. I think as we get towards a general election, obviously Labour isn't going to step back from those seats. We're now in a completely different place to what we were in maybe North Shropshire, Tiverton, Somerton and Frome, all of which I went on the doorsteps with, and Labour really didn't have much of a presence in those, but as we get closer to a general, they're going to. Labour's not going to step back in these elections anymore. And I think how that relationship kind of evolves is going to be fascinating and also key, because Lib Dems clearly think they have a claim over these seats. What is Labour going to do to challenge that? I think we often frame this debate a lot in kind of a Tory-facing way, quite understandably, quite reasonably, but the Lib Dems are there as well, and if they're splitting the vote, does that let the Tories in? Is that what we're going to see in mid-beds? I mean, maybe. So I think that's interesting as well. And I think there has been a step change. I think there has been a move away from Labour being a purely urban party, despite what the government is trying to still spin. You know, you'll still hear in speeches from the Prime Minister him saying, you know, all Labour leaders come from North London and that kind of thing. So I do think there is a PR strategy there, but I think post-pandemic, there is actually more of an opportunity for the Labour Party, because you've seen what might have been more traditional Labour voters from the cities move out into the countryside. Working from home has made that possible. Not to borrow a phrase from the Lib Dems, but they called them the Surrey shufflers, who have moved down from cities and kind of out into the fringes. So I think it's going to be a really interesting election on a rural front, but I think there's still some way to go for the Labour Party to make sure that its communications and selling of those policies, and frankly, as a journalist, I'd like to see some more actual meat on the bone for policies as well, to sell them to the countryside and say, no, this is for you as well, because the policies apply to everyone, but I'm not sure people quite know that yet.
Thanks, Joe. That was, yeah. For the political geeks amongst us, and I think we are probably mostly political geeks, is that I think Cornwall's going to be particularly fascinating, where Labour leapfrogged the Lib Dems into second in a lot of constituencies, and the Liberals do think that they own Cornwall. So it's going to be there's going to be some fascinating rural battles out there. Much more importantly, love to hear from you. Can we keep questions please, rather than statements? And can we keep them as short as possible so we can get as many as possible in? Thank you. The gentleman in the blue shirt at the back.
One of the concerns, I'm a walker, and I love walking in the countryside, and I greatly value the countryside. My partner and I have just come back from walking in Derbyshire, in the peaks. I think the big issues for Labour is elms. How are you going to keep elms going? Are you going to replace it? Are you going to make it better? I mean, theoretically, it's environmentally good and all the rest of it. And particularly, I think sort of access to countryside is a big issue. The other thing, which I believe is on the Labour Party manifesto, inverted commas, yet, is the right to roam. And I'm sure that there's quite a few people in the Countryside Alliance who might not like that very much. It's working quite well in Scotland, so they've had it in since 2003. But it's important that people respect the countryside for that to work properly, you know. So basically, elms, right to roam. And the other thing is, although you might think it's nothing to do with you, ULEZ in the clean air zones affects you in the countryside. The reason being is all the poorer people, mum, dad and 2 kids, are being driven off the road. So they won't be able to go to the countryside, do a bit of camping for holidays and things. That's one of the, shall we say, unintended outcomes perhaps, you know. But that would affect a lot of farmers. A lot of farmers rely on camping and tourism and so forth. But the two things really mainly is elms, our attitude towards elms, the right to roam, which I'm sure you're not very happy with, and so forth. Anyway, thank you.
Well, thank you for that. I was going to have to manufacture a way of getting Daniel to talk about access legislation, so I don't have to now, which is great. I'll just be very clear, the Alliance is very positive about increasing access. It's how you do it. And in fact, we were supportive of Crow way back under the last Labour government. But Daniel, if you wouldn't mind going first, on elms in particular, I know this is a massive subject, it's very difficult, but if you were able to give us a very big, broad picture, and then perhaps we come back to access as well.
And very good, Stephen. Thank you for the question. Look, we've right from the beginning, last year the Agriculture Act, we supported the environmental land management approach, the public money for public good approach. But our criticism from the beginning was that it looked to us to be overly complicated, and we worried about levels of uptake. And I think that's been borne out by the experience. We're almost halfway through now, so farmers are losing roughly half of the money they would have got from the basic payment system, and it's by no means clear that they're able to make that up through the replacement schemes. And the schemes themselves, of course, have changed over time, in the sense that there was quite a lot of ambition for the higher level schemes, the landscape level, and that's still in development. And there is a worry that the SFI, which is the entry level scheme, if you like, is changing each year. I think there's some evidence that the 2023 version there will be better uptake, which is good. But there is a problem in the sense that without a whole farm approach, you can't guarantee that people aren't just using the money in one place and then farming more intensively somewhere else. So we remain enthusiastic. Our ambition is to get that agricultural transition to work. But as I said earlier, it's got to be seen in the context of a proper plan to get to net zero as well. And that is missing from DEFRA at the moment. So in answer to your question, we want to make them work. We're not convinced the current government can do it. On access, really, really important question. Obviously, historically, Labour has always been the party that sought to get better access to nature for everybody in the countryside as well as for urban populations. But I absolutely understand the anxiety that people feel about just that concept of somehow everyone's got a right to do everywhere. No one is arguing for that, in my view. If you actually look at the organisations seeking greater access, they too recognise absolutely this is not a free-for-all. So whenever we talk about this, I want to make sure we're talking about responsible access. And I think there's actually quite a lot more that can be done through Crow. So I want to see more people getting access to the countryside, of course. But what I do not want to see is people, and farmers have made this point to me very, very strongly, we cannot have people just wandering all over the place thinking that somehow they have got this right to go anywhere. Well, no, that's not what we're going to do.
I might come back, abuse my position in chairman and come back on the access stuff in a minute, but before we go there, I just wanted to test for the rest of the panel. There's a sort of conflation between rural votes and farming votes sometimes, and I don't know, Ben, perhaps you might want to start on that, because I mean, I used to be a farmer, but there's not very many farmers, and there's lots of rural voters. How important do you think that farming policy is in here, as far as the rural votes are concerned?
I think it's important as a sort of totemic issue, that if you get it right for farmers, rural voters will be like you are for us, generally speaking, but that doesn't mean that Labour should offer rural voters just farming policy, because you will know that I think it's 85% of rural businesses have no connection to farming. So if you go on the doorstep and talk about we're going to improve farming, they'll be like, great, but I can't get broadband. Or, you know, my bus, well, there is no bus. Or, you know, my kid wants to stay local, but can't. You know, so I think it's a sort of symbolic issue that, you know, it's symbolic, but it doesn't decide things necessarily, because there are, you know, we've done polling and it's public services. When you ask what are the top 3 issues that you want from a Labour government, pretty much far and away the one that always comes out top, regardless of who you ask, is improve NHS services. That is the one thing. Whether you are campaigning in central London, or if you're campaigning in a coastal constituency, or if you're campaigning in the tiniest little village, it will be, you know, you don't have to speak to them very long until they will inevitably talk about the NHS. So it's symbolism, but not necessarily going to decide things.
Yeah. And access to the NHS, at the local level, it's that transport bit as well, isn't it?
Well, yes, I think so. And obviously, we've seen a concentration in centres of excellence in terms of the NHS, which, you know, there's a logic to that, but it just makes it further. So, for example, in Chesterfield, all our children's services are in Sheffield. but our NHS funding works on a Derbyshire. You know, there's a lot of kind of like strange geographical things that have come out over time, which I think and I hope that Labour will address in terms of access to that. But I would just make that pitch as well for social care, because what I hear as well is not just it's about being able to stay in your own home. We know that rural communities are an older demographic on the whole, because they're getting hollowed out, but they're an older demographic. Getting people as carers in rural areas is very difficult because of the wages and the cost of housing and renting, and I think it does come back to those issues. They just manifest themselves in a different way in the countryside, but we still need to address them, because if people can't afford to live in those areas, and then they can't, people can't get workers for their businesses in those areas, they will leave, and then we just further hollow out. And obviously tourism is massively important. It's massively important in Derbyshire, and it's, to the economy. But there's going to be that tension between what services we provide for tourists and what services we provide for the community. And I actually think the Conservatives in Derbyshire have got that wrong, and a lot of our transport is very much focused on tourism and not to work and not to the hospitals or to the train stations. And I know that if we get our Labour mayor elected under our devolution deal, that's one of the things that Claire Ward, who's standing in Derbyshire, Nottinghamshire, was going to address fundamentally, that we need to make this work. Again, going back to clean air, well, I mean, what's not to like about clean air? Who doesn't want clean air? But I think you raise a good point. Our buses in rural areas are often the most gas-guzzling, diesel-belching that have been taken out by the private bus companies out of the cities where they're running their electric buses, and they give us our oldest, most decrepit, and then we're supposed to be thankful because there is bus. One of the things I think that we could do immediately on that is a bus service operators grant at the moment is not linked to the kind of fuel that's used. So there's government subsidy that goes into buses, only right, that's what we want, but it should be linked to the fuel as well, and then it gives the incentive, because we deserve clean air too, and then the tourists can use the services that are there to provide for our communities. But I think we need to look at our communities and what their needs are.
Thank you, Amanda. Joe, can I bring you back to the business of farming as an iconic issue? I've been interested in you talking about the cons. I've been interested in how focused Keir Starmer has been on projecting himself to the farming community in particular. In fact, I had Minette Batters, who chairs the National Farmers Union, was on a panel last week in Manchester with us, and I was teasing her slightly about the fact that she seemed to have a better relationship with Keir than she did with anyone in the current government, to which she smiled quietly. Do you think that this is important, and how do you think Labour are doing as far as the farming vote is concerned?
Yeah, I think it's important. I mean, you mentioned that interview that he'd done at the start. I remember I was looking through the photos, and it was all very. I don't think he was quite. Giving a lamb a bottle, but he really wasn't far off. I think there has definitely been outreach and things like that. I think what there has been more of a focus on has been securing the food supply, actually, in terms of farming, and that seems to be more of a focus at the moment, and understandably why. And I think, if you focus on those policies and they're successful, then that is only going to be a positive for the party. So I think we've seen Keir Starmer do that. What I'm interested in actually is to see what Steve Reid does in his new position, because Steve Reid is a massive campaigner, often seen as an attack dog for the party, and I think if what he says to farmers is going to be very interesting. I've not actually, you'll probably correct me, Daniel, but I've not heard him say too much about farming yet. He's really gone on the kind of sewage and sewage in the waters attack line at the moment, but I think we will see him come over and do some more kind of farming stuff. So that's what I'm particularly interested in. In terms of, is it working? I mean, yes, in a way, but as with a lot of Labour policy at the moment, I find it difficult to differentiate between whether it's working because of what Labour is doing or because of what the Conservatives aren't doing. And it applies across the board, whereas you have to think, if the Conservatives up their game and get some policy out there and do some good things again, will that support for Labour remain? I'm not sure at the moment, is my honest answer, and I think it remains to be seen.
Thanks, Stuart. Just coming back to access for a moment, I said I might just abuse my position, so I shall. I think the first point is that there's never been any trespass legislation in Scotland, and they've never had, there isn't a right to roam, there's just no concept of trespass. But if you want to go, good luck finding a footpath in lowland Scotland. They go for a walk, whereas there's 140,000 miles of them across England and Wales. And I think this is one of those lines, and Daniel and I have talked about this past, this is one of those lines where there is real concern out there in the countryside that this is pushing over into essentially ideological territory. This may be right or may be wrong, but this is a perception that comes from the countryside. This is comes down to the ownership of capital and land, and basically the fact that some people don't like it to some element. And we as an organisation, and most of the organisations we work with, the rural organisations, have always been positive about managed access. But when we are facing the sort of biodiversity crisis that we are at the moment, and you have a population as dense as we do in England, and it's really dense, then there is real concern out there about the potential impact, especially on honeypot areas. Do you think, I don't know whether this, Jerry, just from your perspective, do you think this is an electoral issue? Do you think that access is going to do anyone any good or anyone harm in terms of elections and votes?
No, is the short answer. Sorry, that's not a very. Look, I think it's an important issue for you guys, the kind of people that will come to this panel because it's something you're interested in. I don't think it eclipses the other big issues that are facing the country at the moment. Ben said that the NHS will consistently come up where we talk about cost of living. I don't think it's a big enough issue to move the dial either way electorally. That doesn't mean that politicians on both sides might not get shouted at if they're in a room like this about it. But I think if you're on the doorstep, it's probably not something that's coming up too often.
Great. Sorry, the lady in the flowery dress?
Yeah.
Is this flowery?
Yes. My name is Lizzie Collins. I'm Labour's parliamentary candidate for Morecambe and Lunesdale, which is one of our most beautiful constituencies, I think. My question is about what I believe Ben called the aversion to Labour in the countryside. So I grew up in a very small village in North Cumbria as an incomer and experienced it myself. And when I'm knocking on the doors, knocking in the villages, I get a lot of people who are very angry with the government and who feel very let down and who like our policies, but there's almost still a little hump that they need to get over. So I was wondering, is there any evidence base or any advice for how we get over that hump and over that aversion? Thank you.
Thanks. Ben, I think it's definitely yours for first.
Shall I? So in terms, let's just go back to what I said in my opening remarks. So Labour was equal with the Conservatives in rural communities. However, the same polling showed that Labour had, I think, something probably in the region of about 20 percentage point lead. Again, not much has changed. And then in the rural target seats, Labour was 18 percentage points ahead. However, when you look at the 150 seats overall, it was somewhere in the region of 22 percentage points ahead. Now that's partly due to demographics, and there's not much Labour can do about demographics. The fact that there are more people who are, generally speaking, less inclined to support Labour, so over 55s, particularly less inclined to vote Labour, and homeowners are similarly also less inclined to vote Labour, and there are also fewer degree holders. So perhaps one of the best things that Labour could do is build lots of homes that allow degree holders to move to the countryside. And we have seen that with constituencies and councils across the country that have, for generations been backing the Conservatives, and then in very recent years have flipped to Labour because, particularly around Brighton, for example, the councils around there have trended more to Labour because no one can afford a house in Brighton. But it's not just about demographics. When we actually look at, for example, under 55, who are more open, obviously, to voting Labour than over 55, there is a 16-point gap, so you are 16% less likely to vote Labour if you are under 55 and in a rural area than if you are under 55 and living in Great Britain overall. Similarly with degree holders, and similarly with ABC1s, which is the sort of the non-working class group in social grade. So that's the sort of cultural aversion. One thing I would say, sort of, that is quite depressing, but the Conservatives had a very significant aversion in the Red Wall until very recently. And well, to be honest, in the Red Wall that's coming back, but we don't know if it's structural. So we shouldn't be disheartened that just because there is this cultural aversion now, that it will stay that way. This trust has been deeply helpful to us in overcoming that aversion. If there's one Prime Minister in recent years that has been less in keeping with quote-unquote rural values, it's perhaps Liz Truss deciding to smash everything up and hope that things will turn out okay, and obviously they did not. So that's a big thing in terms of what Jerry said. Yes, absolutely, the Conservatives are doing a lot of the work for us, but that shouldn't necessarily underplay what Labour's done. I think one of the practical things that Labour can do, and actually Labour HQ can do, and Daniel knows this because it was in a round table that we had earlier this year, is that Labour HQ treats campaigning in urban areas the same as campaigning in rural areas in terms of meeting your targets. Even though campaigning in urban areas, you walk down one doorstep, you're there, you just keep going, and you've got 100 done in maybe an hour, depending on how many people decide not to open the door. Trying to do 100 in a rural constituency is incredibly difficult. It takes 4 hours. So I think there needs to be some sort of cultural change in terms of not, saying that only focus on rural areas, but to actually reflect the fact that campaigning in rural areas is much harder, and therefore the target should be perhaps more favourable. Obviously, we all still need to meet them and make sure we do it. And so I think that's one really practical thing, because if we can sort of rebalance between urban and rural communities when it comes to campaigning, we're going to be on the doorstep more there, and when they see us there, they will understand that we're not scary, we're not going to, steal all of their cars, we're not going to do a meat tax, for example, we're not going to introduce 7 bins, we're not going to introduce 15-minute neighbourhoods, I can't pronounce it. Although, to be honest, a 15-minute neighbour thing sounded just like a village to me that was quite successful. So so that's the really practical thing that I think we should all try and persuade Labour HQ to do, that subtle change, to make sure that we're all on the doorstep more often in rural community and really reconnecting with them, because too often we're not there because it's too hard.
Thank you. Daniel, this aversion, I mean, the numbers, the numbers are there. We've heard a bit, Ben's ideas. How do you see the Labour Party getting over this?
Very similar to Ben. It's a very good analysis, and kind of thank you, Lucy, for what you're doing. I mean, one thing that strikes me is something which hasn't perhaps been much talked about, but the calibre of Labour candidates this time round is strikingly different. I speak as someone who's been a candidate many years myself, but the current crop of candidates is exceptional, and that will make a difference. It will make a difference also if Labour forms a government. I think people have talked about that very much. It would be very, very different, and I think hugely welcome. The answer to the aversion question, I think we've all known for a long, long time. If you can talk to people directly, actually it evaporates almost immediately. The problem is, and it's a chicken and egg situation, if you've gone backwards and you've lost your representatives and you've lost confidence, and local parties have to some extent disappeared, and that's not just true of the Labour Party, that's a wider question, I think, issue for all the parties, it then becomes more difficult to overcome that aversion issue. I won my seat in a very rural part of Norfolk many, many years ago on a time-honoured basis. You just go around and talk to people. And after you got past the first couple of sentences, and they see, hopefully, that you're not a raving idiot who wants to come and do all kinds of horrible things to them, then actually you move on to completely different territory. And in a way, I think we have too often allowed others to frame the debate. The debate shouldn't be about whether Labour wants to alter the rights of access to the countryside. That's others framing the debate. Our debate is about how do we reintroduce the village shop, for instance, to actually create that community again. Now, the Tories are never going to do that because they just believe you leave it to the market. Well, they left it to the market, and look what happens. Communities get destroyed. We're Labour, and people get that part of it. So it's not easy because you can't just impose these things. You've got to work with people. But we're far more likely to be able to do it. And I think people get that. And if we can go and talk to people on that positive level about positive messages and the kind of way we can recreate those communities in the countryside. As Ben said, people like villages. They really like the idea of a village. And as I said, to me, if you've not got anything left, if you're not, the last community centre, the last pub has gone, that makes a huge difference. That's the message of hope we should be offering. And I think we can do that. I think we actually can make it happen. And that's why I'm really rather excited about a rural renaissance for Labour. And then once you've done that, I think the evidence shows then people no longer think of their local representatives as Labour. They think of them as the person they know. And then it's natural to vote for them. So that's the way we do it. I'm afraid I don't have to go in this. It's probably my last contribution. But thank you very much
Thank
for
you, Dan.
giving me the opportunity today. Some of you will notice that we have a huge number of events this year. I've never been asked to do so many events, which I think answers the question a bit about are people interested. I could probably be doing 45 fringe events in 3 days. Actually, I can't do 45 fringe events in 3 days. But I do need to be another one at 3, so I need to go in a moment.
Well,
thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you for being here, Daniel. I'd just point out that the Countryside Alliance I've been at the Countryside Alliance 20 years, and we've been at the Labour conference every year for those 20 years. So up or down, we're always here. I think that candidate point, if I could make an apolitical point, I think it's a really interesting one about rural constituents as well. I don't know whether there is data, there probably is somewhere here, but the perception certainly, and this doesn't. This is the same as when I was at Bournemouth with the Lib Dems 2 weeks ago, or the Tories last week, or here that candidates in rural constituencies matter more. But there is, rural people like to know who they know who their MP is sometimes, so I think that's a really interesting point. Daniel, thank you. Do slip off when you can.
Yeah.
We have got time for one more. So the gentleman here.
We touched on a lot of points, very kind of hinted at them. So I'm Jason, one of the new councillors in York, and I mention that for 2 reasons. One is because we just took the council from the Dems, and the second is because we were a C of one red constituency with the rest of North Yorkshire blue until recently we took Selby and Ainsley as well. So we're winning that fight in the rural areas near us. I'm looking forward to York Outer and to Scarborough going red in the near future at the next general. The question I've got is kind of twofold related to that. Is when we're door knocking, there are some issues that seem to be getting worse and more challenging in rural areas. We talked about sort of devolving powers to councils, but what it has done across the policy state, health, crime, transport, is you end up with pockets of different decisions that don't line up. That sort of county boundaries, borders area, in transport and for crime in particular, but also just in healthcare, depending on which village you live in, you get different healthcare and different quality of healthcare. So how do we tackle that? And then you mentioned housing and building housing. I think we're coming to a crisis point as a country that we've built on all the brownfields. All the factories that have been gone over the last few decades are now all housing already. So how do we continue to build? We're going to have to look at the greener spaces. That challenge of farmland, green belts, nature reserves, wildlife, all of that sort of thing, looking at the housing that we need to build for people who want to stay rural and local, but also just moving out the cities into rural areas. How do we tackle that challenge as a country without it becoming a problem for A, voting for being next generation?
Amanda, I might come back to postcode lotteries and devolution and the challenge there in a second, but I think the housing point's a really important one. I'd start on that. And again, using my position, I just throw something in there. I think that it's not just about where you build the house, it's what you build on it. And coming from the southeast of England at the moment, as many of you will, there's a huge amount of house building going on. But is that addressing the needs of rural communities? Most often not, because it's a different sort of housing, and it's not doing that. Ben, how do you see this as a thing we've made? I think we've all got the point, and we all knew it instinctively anyway, that national issues or rural issues is the framing that's important. But how do you see, in particular, the housing debate impacting on rural constituencies?
Well, personally, it's actually very interesting when Labour came out in favour of building partially on the green belt, because we put a question in the just literally I think a week before it was announced. We got the data a day before it was announced, so it's very fortunate the circumstances. So in terms of so what we did was we actually did a really interesting thing where we split the sample into two. One person saw a question saying, we're going to build on the green belt. I say we as not Labour, but generally speaking. And then the other question was, we're going to build on land that is restricted for certain types of development, so i.e. presenting what the green belt policy is without using the phrase green belt. Now, you won't be surprised to learn that people don't want to build on the green belt. You know, that is a fact. Although, to be honest, you know, I think it was somewhere in the region of about a third in rural communities were in favour. So that's more than I was expecting, to be honest. The really interesting thing was the one where you don't mention the green belt. And now, obviously, that's incredibly difficult because the Conservatives will scream green belt at every moment. And in fact, I'm surprised Rishi Sunak didn't mention it in his conference speech. But actually, when you look at it, the population is evenly split. Roughly around 40–45% don't want to build on restricted land because they know it's a green belt. But about half say they're in favour of some development, and it's some development that's the key question. So we at the Fabians did a commission on poverty and regional inequality that set out quite comprehensively a set of housing policies, and one of the things we said was, for example, build on the green belt, absolutely. Build on the green belt that isn't green. You know, there is a lot of the green belt that isn't green. We've got Rishi Sunak that says, oh, I'm opposed to building on the green belt, but I really want to make it easier to build in national parks. And I'm like, you've got that the wrong way around. We should. The fact that the Prime Minister wants to protect car parks, but not national parks, including the national park that his constituency touches, is, I think, getting it the wrong way around. So, you know, building on the car parks, building on non-environmentally prestigious land with no amenity value. No one's going to cry over a car park being lost, perhaps except Theresa Villas, who is very opposed to building on car parks. So that's the first thing. The other thing is, I think a lot of people, when we say we're going to build more in the green belt, go, well, that's great, but most of the houses in my community are empty 6 months of the year because they're owned by someone who doesn't live here. So cracking down on second homes, making sure that all homes that are within a community are being used effectively. And then the other thing is making sure, as you said, Tim, that the right homes are built. Social housing. Everyone is pretty much in favour of building more social housing, so pushing that. Also making sure that developers, as we've seen from Labour, can't get out their Section 106 agreements as easily. And then I think finally, sort of from a how do we communicate, obviously good policy, how do we communicate, I think we are going to have to basically say to people, if you want your GP surgery to stay open, if you want your bus route to stay, if you want your community centre to open, that's all obviously if we say you've still got one, if you want your school to stay open, the fact is we're going to have to build more houses in your community because otherwise the countryside now will not be the countryside for the next generation, and all we will see is a lot of villages and towns emptying if we don't get this right. So it is a kind of a brutal point that we have to make to the public, but I think it's a point that they will respect and actually realise probably is accurate.
Matt, I want to come back to you, but very quickly, Jerry, sorry, we're running out of time. But, brave or foolhardy tackling the NIMBY element. Should Labour be doing it, shouldn't they?
Yeah, I think you've got to. And look, I am our by-elections correspondent. I ends up being sent out on the road to do all the door knocks and all these by-elections we've had. And I think I've noticed a kind of change in attitudes because politics is personal, right? Until it affects you, you kind of don't really care about it. But more and more people are seeing that their kids can't buy in the area, that they're struggling. I was on the doorstep with someone the other day, and a woman said, I've had to help my son get onto the housing ladder, but he's 35, and I can't believe I'm having to do that, and what on earth is going on? She was a Tory to Labour switcher. So I think there are electoral advantages to it. I think the reason it's become kind of at such a crisis point right now is people are actually being impacted by it themselves rather than hearing about it in abstract way.
Thank you. Amanda.
I'm going to make it in one point. People will support it if you keep it in perpetuity for local need and local people. And we've had some great success around Derbyshire, in Yorgrave and Bradwell and other places where we've had Labour councillors elected, campaigning on the doorstep on that issue, getting those houses built, and then they're protected in perpetuity. We need to strengthen local councils' hand on this. We need to change planning law, and that needs to be in the first 100 days of the Labour government.
And very quickly, just to finish, the point about devolution versus sort of a postcode lottery, the challenge of devolution, so I'm afraid it's definitely yours since you started with devolution.
Yes, well, I think one of the biggest challenges for all councils, regardless of party, is the beauty pageant parade of different funding and the competition. And that's something that Labour has already committed to end again on day one. If people need it, we need it. Why do we have to bid for it? Why do we have to put all of that time and resource? So devolution will work, and it will work better under Labour because we'll stop that immediately. We'll give councils that money. We know that we're more efficient actually in local government than central government, and we proved that through COVID. There is evidence after evidence after evidence. Actually, if you give us the money and funding in local councils, we will do it better, we'll do it faster, and we'll do it cheaper. So that's how devolution needs to work.
Well, thank you very much. Perfect way to end. Thank you all for coming. We may or may not gather here at the next Labour conference. I think probably not. but if all the predictions are right, but it will be extremely interesting to watch how this develops, and us geeks will be there poring over those constituencies and saying exactly how wrong we were, how right we were. But thank you all for coming. It's been a really good conversation, and as ever, I'm only sad that we didn't have a little bit longer to do it. But thank you very much.